Welcome everybody to my first installment of Upate News, wherein I, in as great detail as I am capable, will be covering the entirety of the Trailmakers 1.9.5 update. Today's Update News will be divided into 3 different segments in correspondence to the 3 dev diaries we were given. The first of which will cover graphical improvements as well as all the new blocks we are getting. Unrelated side note before continuing with the new blocks, right mouse button support is coming to Steam. Originally, right click was used to release the camera, whichever camera mode you were using, and look around. This was removed in 1.6 and the devs finally felt comfortable with giving it to us to use for our creations. Now, there are a bunch of new blocks coming to the game, mostly consisting of some air intakes. The fighter, rounded, bulky, and propeller air intakes. These intake blocks can be found in the frame category in the build menu, and this will be because unlike other detail blocks, they will have an aerodynamic effect, so you won't have to sacrifice performance in order for them to be used. The other block coming to the game is the new aiming servo. Here is what it looks like, as well as its configuration menu. The aiming servo turns to point in the direction the camera is facing. It accepts one keybind which inverts its activity, meaning if you have it on by default, it will turn off upon input and vice versa. You have a speed and strength setting just like a normal servo, and you have angle limitations in both directions up to 180 degrees, which, and this is pretty self-explanatory, but it will just make it so that the servo will only turn within the range you specify. Handy for if you have a custom turret and you don't want it to clip with the rest of your build. The hold position function serves as an option to let the servo stay in the rotation it currently finds itself when you turn it off, as opposed to just returning to its starting position. The use cases for this I could think of are the following: stabilized tank turrets and otherwise turrets in general mounted on cars, boats, spaceships, and other creations. Fine motor control on things like mechs to pick things up or aim guns, or coupling them with stabilizers to create a simple and effective mouse steering for your creations on any axis. The final part of this segment is the latest DLC, namely the Skin Pack 3. This will cost $4.99 US, or whatever that converts to in your local currency, and it adds 8 new skins for you to use. The skins look like this: the digital camo, which uses a darker version of color 1 for the third color, graffiti, in which the background color is always black, pipes, gears, metal plates, rust, wherein the rust color stays the same and you paint the classic color groups, weathered, and geometric pattern. Onto the second segment of this video, which is the logic. In last week's video I briefly covered them all, and I will try my best to do a little better, as well as elaborate on some of them a little bit. The functions block, as you may know, adds a multitude of functions to Trailmakers. To understand how you would even begin to figure out uses for this block, you have to know what each function does. The first function is absolute. This returns the absolute value of an input without any signs attached. For example, putting in -4 would return just 4. The second function is sign, which returns the state in which a number is. The law of trichotomy states that every real number must be positive, negative, or 0, and this function sorts any input that it gets into one of those categories before sending a corresponding output to its targets. The third function is square root, which just extracts the root of inputs. The ceiling and floor functions return the nearest integer up or down. For example, with 2.008, floor would return 2 and ceiling would return 3. Rounding always rounds to the nearest number. And finally, we have some trigonometric functions. They are all, as that suggests, to do with right triangles, and to understand them we need to know some things. This is a right triangle. There is its right angle. This is our chosen undetermined angle. The hypotenuse is opposite the right angle. The opposite side is the side across from our chosen angle. The adjacent side is the remaining side, which is always part of the chosen angle. And with these things in mind, we can decipher the remaining operations that the function's logic block has. The tangent function takes the length of the opposite side and divides it by the length of the adjacent side. The cosine function is the ratio of the adjacent side to the hypotenuse, or adjacent divided by hypotenuse. The sine function is almost the same thing. You divide the length of the opposite side by the length of the hypotenuse. Now that may have been a lot to take in, but there's some simple bits left to go over before we get to the fun part. The other two logic blocks added were the random block and the aggregate block. The random block has multiple settings, the first of which is output on input, which only randomizes and sends to targets when it receives an input. Change on input, which always outputs the randomly generated number until it receives an input, then it will cause a new number to be generated and then start sending that new number to its targets. Input defines range is when you give it an input, it generates a number between that input and 0 and then sends it to targets. The last setting is minus change plus output. This one means that when the block gets an input below 0, it produces a new random number, and when it gets an input above 0, it sends that number to its targets. Now, onto the aggregate block. This block also has multiple settings. It takes any and all inputs it receives and then does one of the following. It adds all the inputs together, multiplies them all together, finds the smallest input or the largest input. Finally, depending on which of those you choose, it sends that out to its targets. There were some new functions added to the already existing arithmetic logic gate. Before, we had add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Now, we also have exponent functions as well as modulo. Modulo returns the remainder of a division operation. As for the exponent function, we will use 3 for the constant and 4 for the input. The arithmetic logic block has settings to either constant to the power of x or x to the power of constant, meaning 3 to the power of 4 would equal 81, and 4 to the power of 3 would equal 64. The final part of this segment goes over the new output setting for all sensors in the game. Previously, you were only able to send outputs from the sensor if it was sensing something. Now, that method defaults to the trigger setting. You have 2 new options, one being measurement. This allows you to get the absolute value from a sensor. For example, if a speed sensor detects you going 10 kilometers an hour in a certain direction, it will output 10 to its targets. The other being normalized. This one is essentially the same as measurement, however, it takes that reading and adapts it to display strictly on a range between 0 and 1. We also have the option to offset the place where the raycast beams out of the distance sensor. The final segment covers the part that I would assume the majority of people are the most excited about, which would be the new map. Now, when I say this map is exciting, let me tell you, I am neither lying nor wrong. It is a lot, if not most, of what many people have been asking for from a map. It's called the Great Barrier Reef, obviously a play on words nod to the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia, and, like the name suggests, it has two carriers on either side as well as a runway in the middle, all situated in a tropical archipelago with seemingly some nice diversity underwater too. Water's a bit blue. I know some would appreciate looking more like that in high seas, but that's not a big deal. I know this is going to be a very popular map among aviation enthusiastic makers of trails. That's been it for the 1.9.5 installment of Upate News. Thank you very much for watching. I sincerely hope you enjoyed. If you feel like this video has earned your subscription, then please act accordingly down below. I'll see you again in the next one, but until then, take care.